The Western Front, 1916. The war was not going as planned. What began as a vision of swift, mobile conflict had congealed into a nightmarish stalemate, a festering line of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Behind these lines, the logistical machinery of the British Empire groaned under a strain it was never designed to bear. The problem was not just men or munitions. It was space. Dry, secure, rapidly deployable space. The war demanded an endless appetite for it. For storage of everything from artillery shells to boots, for workshops to repair trucks and tanks, for hospitals to treat the endless river of wounded, and for barracks to shelter the waves of new recruits arriving from home. Existing solutions were failing catastrophically. Canvas tents rotted in the relentless damp, offered poor insulation, and were shredded by wind. Wooden structures required skilled labor, vast quantities of precious timber, and weeks to construct, luxuries the war effort could not afford. The British Army was drowning in mud, and it needed a lifeboat, something cheap, durable, and above all, fast. Into this crisis stepped Lieutenant Colonel Peter Norman Nissen of the 29th Company, Royal Engineers. He was not a career politician or a distant theorist. He was a practical man on the ground, staring directly at the problem. In the squalor and chaos of the front, Nissen began to sketch. His vision was one of radical simplicity. He looked to the industrial age for inspiration, to the great arched roofs of railway sheds and the robust, corrugated iron sheets used for factories and farms. What if, he reasoned, you could take that principle of strength through curvature and reduce it to its absolute simplest form? What if a building could be nothing more than a self-supporting, semicircular shell? The genius of the Nissen hut was not in inventing something entirely new, but in a brilliant act of engineering synthesis. His design was a masterpiece of economy. It would be composed of skeleton made not of heavy timber, but of light, curved steel ribs. This frame would be clad in corrugated steel sheets, a material that was strong, readily available, and provided a naturally draining surface. The interior walls and ends were simple timber frames, also clad in corrugated steel, with doors and windows cut in as needed. The entire structure was designed to be bolted together, not welded or nailed. This was its killer feature. The prototype, erected in April 1916, was a revelation. A team of 6 unskilled men, working with nothing more than wrenches, could assemble a 16-foot by 24-foot hut from a flat pack of components in a matter of hours, not weeks. It required no foundation beyond a simple concrete pad or even just level ground. Its arched shape was inherently strong, resistant to shell blasts, and capable of shedding rain and snow with ease. The corrugated iron skin, while Spartan, was waterproof and far more durable than canvas. The space inside, though open and echoing, was vast and unobstructed, perfect for storing long rows of supplies, lining up hospital cots, or housing a platoon of soldiers. The British Army's Directorate of Works saw the potential immediately. They recognized that this was not merely a new building. It was a logistical weapon. The Nissen hut could be mass-produced in Britain's industrial heartlands, knocked down into incredibly compact bundles of steel, and shipped to any corner of the globe. Upon arrival, it could be deployed by a handful of men with minimal training, creating instant infrastructure wherever it was needed. It was a solution that matched the industrial scale of the war itself. By 1917, the huts were pouring out of factories and onto the front lines. They sprang up like steel mushrooms across the battered landscape of France and Flanders. They served as workshops where armaments were repaired just miles from the fighting, as warehouses guarding precious supplies from the elements, as barracks offering a dry, if drafty, respite from the trenches, and as casualty clearing stations where countless lives were saved under their curved iron roofs. The design was iterated and improved. Different sizes were introduced, and a layer of felt was sometimes added between an inner and outer skin of corrugated iron to combat condensation, a persistent issue. The Nissen hut was born not from a desire for comfort or aesthetic beauty, but from the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of modern warfare. It was a product of urgency, a child of necessity. It represented a fundamental shift in military thinking. The understanding that victory depended as much on supply chains and infrastructure as it did on bravery and tactics. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, over 100,000 Nissen huts had been produced. They had become an indelible part of the military landscape, a symbol of British industrial ingenuity and grim determination. And as the world began to dismantle its armies, this simple, corrugated iron arch would not fade into obscurity. Its legacy was secure, and its design was about to embark on a new journey across the Atlantic, where it would be adapted, and transformed into an American icon for the next great global conflict. To understand why the Nissen hut became such a transformative tool for the British war effort, one must move beyond its simple, curved silhouette and dissect it with the cold, appreciative eye of a military engineer. This was not architecture in the traditional sense. It was a brilliantly conceived industrial product, where every bolt, every rib, and every corrugated sheet was optimized for a single, overriding purpose: rapid deployment under chaotic conditions. Its genius lay in a ruthless adherence to the principles of prefabrication, minimalism, and structural efficiency. The foundation of the hut's success was its revolutionary framing system. At its heart were the steel ribs, the building skeleton. Each rib was not a single, cumbersome piece, but a clever assembly of curved segments, typically three, that bolted together at the crown and the skirting. This segmentation was the first critical feature for speed. It meant that the entire structural frame could be broken down into a compact, flat-packed bundle of nearly identical components that could be stacked efficiently in the hold of a ship or the bed of a truck. There was no need for heavy machinery or cranes. The largest segment was a manageable size for a small team of soldiers to lift and position by hand. The process of erection was a masterpiece of logical sequencing, designed to be performed by men who were not carpenters or masons, but soldiers following a simple manual. The assembly began with the creation of the end frames. These were rigid, triangular structures that acted as the bookends for the entire building. Once these two ends were positioned and made plumb, the first and most critical rib was hoisted into place and bolted to them. This established the hut's precise geometry. From this point, the assembly line could begin. Subsequent ribs were lifted into position, one after another, and bolted not only to the skirting, but also to each other via longitudinal purlins, the horizontal members that ran the length of the hut. These purlins were the second element of genius. As each new rib was added, the purlins were bolted on, creating an instantly rigid and self-bracing structure. The act of adding each new component inherently strengthened the whole. There was no waiting for the entire frame to be up before adding stability. The structure gained integrity with every turn of a wrench. This was a stark contrast to traditional wooden structures, which required complex bracing and skilled joinery to remain standing during construction. With the rib and purlin skeleton complete, the building was already structurally sound, a graceful, freestanding arch ready for its skin. That skin was corrugated galvanized iron. The choice of material was as deliberate as the frame's design. The corrugations were not merely an aesthetic holdover from Victorian factory roofs. They were a fundamental reinforcement. The ridges and troughs gave the thin steel sheet immense longitudinal strength, allowing it to span between the ribs without sagging. The galvanization, a coating of zinc, was a crucial defense against rust, giving the hut a fighting chance against the relentless damp of a European winter. The sheets were laid on the frame like scales, overlapping to shed water, and secured with simple drive screws that could be fastened quickly with a screw gun or even a hammer. The entire exterior could be clad in a matter of hours. The interior was a study in Spartan utility. The arch created a large, open floor plan, unobstructed by pillars or load-bearing walls. This was invaluable space for storing long, bulky items like artillery pieces, vehicle parts, or rows of hospital cots. The walls were typically lined with a second, inner skin of corrugated iron, with a layer of felt or building paper sandwiched in between in an attempt to control the hut's most notorious flaw: condensation. In cold weather, The difference between the outside air and the warmth inside would cause moisture to condense heavily on the inside of the steel skin, leading to a constant, dripping rain. While never fully solved, this double skin method was the pragmatic, if imperfect, countermeasure. The ends of the hut were its most adaptable feature. They were simple timber-framed walls, infilled with more corrugated steel. Standardized door and window frames could be cut into these ends as needed. A storage hut might have a single large sliding door. A barracks would have a standard door and several windows. A hospital might have multiple doors for stretcher access. This modularity meant the same core kit could be configured for a dozen different uses without redesigning the fundamental structure. The final, and perhaps most profound, element of its anatomy was its logistical footprint. A complete 24-foot by 16-foot Nissen hut, designed to house up to 24 men or a significant volume of stores, could be broken down and packed into a single, standard-sized military truck. This was its ultimate triumph. It was not just a building, it was a single, portable unit of infrastructure. From the segmentation of the ribs to the bolt-together assembly and the standardized sheet sizes, every aspect of the Nissen hut's design was a calculated answer to the problem of how to build robust shelter at the speed of modern war. It was a machine for making space, and in the brutal efficiency of its anatomy, it had no equal. The seismic shock of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, shattered any lingering illusion of American isolation. The United States was thrust into a global war on an unprecedented scale, and almost overnight, its military faced a logistical crisis that dwarfed even what the British had encountered in 1916. The nation had to transform itself into what President Roosevelt would call the arsenal of democracy, a process that involved mobilizing millions of men and projecting their power across two vast oceans. This Herculean task required not just ships and tanks, but an entire hidden infrastructure of shelter that could be deployed anywhere from the frozen tundra of Alaska to the sweltering jungles of the South Pacific. It was in this desperate, pressing need that the American military's gaze fell upon the British Nissen hut. The design did not arrive on American shores by accident. Even before formal U.S. entry into the war, the Lend-Lease program had created a close military and industrial partnership with Great Britain. American engineers and officers observed the British military's use of the Nissen hut with keen interest. They saw the same virtues that had impressed the British a generation earlier: speed of erection, minimal labor requirements, and efficient shipping. For the U.S. Navy, which was about to embark on a sprawling island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, the appeal was immediate and powerful. They needed structures that could be landed on captured beaches and assembled by Seabees, the Navy's legendary construction battalions, with the same speed and efficiency they used to build airstrips. The Nissen design appeared to be the perfect, ready-made solution. In early 1942, the task of creating an American version of this British marvel was handed to the George A. Fuller Company, a major construction firm. The project was overseen by the Bureau of Yards and Docks, and the location for its development was the Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island. The name of this location would become forever etched into the American lexicon. The structures were christened Quonset huts, a name that would soon evoke a familiar, semi-cylindrical shape on every front from Normandy to Guadalcanal. The American adoption, however, was not a simple act of copying. It was an act of translation, an effort to adapt a proven foreign design to the unique industrial might and specific military doctrines of the United States. The initial model, known as the T1, was a clear and direct descendant of the Nissen. It retained the 16-foot diameter and semicircular arch, but it introduced key modifications that reflected American manufacturing preferences. Most notably, the T1 was framed with steel ribs, but its skin was made of pressed wood or masonite, a material more readily available in the vast American timber industry than steel, which was critically needed for ships and tanks. This first iteration was a test, a proof of concept rushed into production to meet the immediate, overwhelming demand for shelter. The initial success of the T1 prototype confirmed the fundamental soundness of the concept. But American engineers, true to their nature, immediately saw room for improvement and standardization on a mass scale. The project was quickly transferred to the Great Lakes Steel Corporation, which brought its full industrial expertise to bear. The result was the definitive and iconic Quonset hut, the T2 model. This was the version that would be produced in the hundreds of thousands and become a symbol of American military presence worldwide. The T2 was a significant evolution from its British ancestor. It was larger, with a standardized 20-foot width and 48-foot length, providing a more spacious and practical interior. Its most critical design change was the move from a pure semicircle to a semi-elliptical arch. This subtle but important geometric shift created steeper side walls and more usable vertical space at the edges of the hut, reducing the wasted space where the curved walls met the floor. The framing system was also refined, using a solid, lightweight steel I-beam for the ribs, which was strong, easy to produce, and simplified assembly. The manufacturing process itself was a testament to American mass production philosophy. The Great Lakes Steel Corporation set up a dedicated, high-volume assembly line that churned out complete Quonset hut kits. Each kit was a self-contained unit, packaged with every single component needed for assembly. The steel ribs, the purlins, the corrugated steel sheets, the end walls, and even the nuts, bolts, and necessary tools. This kit of parts approach was perfectly suited to the chaos of forward deployment. A shipment of Quonset huts could be loaded onto a cargo ship in New York, transported across the U-boat-infested Atlantic, unloaded onto a Normandy beach, and erected by a crew of engineers who had never seen one before, guided by nothing more than the instructional manual packed inside. By mid-1942, the Quonset hut was in full mass production, becoming a ubiquitous feature of the American war machine. It was a product of urgent necessity, born from the brilliant template of the Nissen hut, but re-engineered through the lens of American industry. It was larger, slightly more refined, and built with the relentless efficiency of a Detroit assembly line. Yet, in this process of adaptation, the Americans had also, perhaps unknowingly, introduced changes that would have significant consequences in the field. The move to a larger, more complex structure and the shift in fundamental geometry, while offering advantages in space, would soon reveal critical vulnerabilities when compared to the original, simpler British design in the brutal reality of combat deployment. The stage was set for a direct, unintended competition. The American adoption of the arched hut was never intended to be a mere copy. It was an act of re-engineering, driven by a different industrial philosophy and a distinct set of logistical requirements. Where the British Nissen was a product of trench warfare urgency, a minimalist solution to an immediate, grinding problem, the American Quonset became a product of a nation mobilizing for global power projection. This fundamental difference in origin led to a series of design choices that, while logical on the drawing board, produced a cascade of unintended consequences in the field. The Quonset, for all its strengths, was a different beast altogether, and its deviations from the Nissen formula created a set of trade-offs that would ultimately define its legacy. The most significant departure was the shift in fundamental geometry. The original Nissen was a true semicircle, a form dictated by the pure logic of structural efficiency. The American T2 Quonset abandoned this classic arch in favor of a semi-elliptical shape. This change was driven by a perfectly reasonable desire for more usable interior volume. The semi-elliptical design created steeper sidewalls, which meant a soldier could stand upright near the perimeter of the hut without his head brushing against the curving steel. It provided more practical space for lining up cots, workbenches, or storage racks along the walls. On paper, and in the controlled environment of a stateside base, this was a clear improvement. It made the structure feel less like a tunnel and more like a building. However, this geometric shift came with a profound structural compromise. A semicircular arch is an inherently stable form. It distributes load, whether from snow, wind, or the concussive force of a nearby explosion, perfectly evenly along its curve, channeling the stress directly down into the foundations. The semi-elliptical arch of the Quonset lost this perfect harmony. Its altered curvature created different stress points. The steeper sides and flatter crown introduced moments of higher tension, particularly at the points where the curve transitioned. To counteract this, the Quonset required a more robust and heavier framing system. The American I-beam ribs were stronger than the lighter British truss work, but they were also heavier and less forgiving. Under extreme load, such as the heavy snows of a European winter or the typhoon-force winds of the Pacific, the Quonset structure was more prone to localized failure, buckling at its weak points where the Nissen's pure arch would have simply shed the load. This structural difference was compounded by the American decision to scale the hut up significantly. The standard T2 Quonset was 20 feet wide and 48 feet long, and even larger models were developed, some stretching to 40 feet in width. This was a testament to American bigger is better thinking, but it amplified the inherent weaknesses of the non-circular design. A larger span magnified the stress problems. The components became heavier, the sheets of corrugated steel larger, and more difficult for a small team to handle. The British Nissen's genius was in its human-scale manageability. The Quonset, in its pursuit of spaciousness, began to lose that key attribute of rapid, effortless deployment by a handful of fatigued men. The American manufacturing process itself, for all its celebrated efficiency, introduced another critical vulnerability: the end walls. The British Nissen used simple, site-built timber frames for its ends, which were flexible and easily reparable. The Quonset, in its drive for total prefabrication, often featured end walls made of heavy, pressed steel. These were shipped as complete units. While this ensured standardization, it created a massive, single point of failure. A shell blast, a collapsing tree, or even a careless truck driver could easily crumple one of these rigid end walls. Repairing such damage in the field was nearly impossible. It required cutting and welding, skills and equipment not always at hand. A damaged Nissen end could be patched with scrap wood and corrugated iron by a carpenter. A smashed Quonset end was often a total loss, rendering the entire structure useless. The very completeness of the American kit became its Achilles heel, lacking the modular repairability of its more rudimentary British cousin. Furthermore, the Quonset's interior environment often proved inferior. The larger volume of air was more difficult to heat, and the condensation problem, infamous in both huts, was often more pronounced in the Quonset. The standardized kits sometimes had poorer insulation, and the complex curvature of the semi-elliptical arch could create odd air pockets where moisture would accumulate and drip. While both huts were Spartan, the Quonset's attempts at domesticity, its more room-like feel, often fell short, leaving occupants with all the discomforts of a steel shelter, but in a larger, harder-to-heat space. These were not failures of American engineering, but rather consequences of its priorities. The Quonset was designed to be a more complete, more substantial building, produced with unparalleled speed on home soil and shipped as a turnkey product. It was optimized for the American industrial base and for the initial setup of large, semi-permanent bases. The Nissen, by contrast, was optimized for the brutal reality of the front line, for speed of assembly under fire, for ruggedness, and for field repair. The Quonset was a superb, prefabricated building. The Nissen remained a superior piece of military field equipment. In the global test of war that followed, these philosophical differences, etched in steel, would become starkly apparent, determining which hut was truly faster and more resilient where it mattered most. The true test of any military technology is not its performance in a controlled demonstration, but its utility under fire. For the Nissen and Quonset huts, the Second World War provided a global, unforgiving laboratory. While both structures poured out of their respective factories in staggering numbers, their deployment across diverse and hostile theaters, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma and the islands of the Pacific, revealed a critical divergence. The Quonset, a product of American mass production genius, often proved to be the superior product in terms of initial assembly and spaciousness. But the Nissen, a product of frontline necessity, consistently demonstrated itself to be the superior tool for warfare, exhibiting unparalleled speed, resilience, and adaptability in the crucible of combat. The production race was a spectacle of industrial might. American factories, having fully mobilized their immense capacity, achieved a staggering output. The Great Lakes Steel Corporation and other manufacturers perfected an assembly line process that turned out Quonset hut kits with a rhythm that would have been unimaginable to the British in 1916. At their peak, these facilities produced over 1,000 huts per week. Each kit was a marvel of packaging, containing every nut, bolt, and panel needed. This was industrial logistics at its finest, designed to feed the insatiable appetite of a two-ocean war. The British production of the Nissen hut, while efficient and robust, simply could not match the sheer volumetric output of the American system. In the race of the factories, the Quonset was the undisputed winner. However, this victory on the home front began to unravel the moment the huts reached their destinations. The first and most critical test was speed of erection. The standard British Nissen hut, with its lighter, simpler components and pure, semicircular design, could be assembled by a team of 6 inexperienced men in under 4 hours. It was a process that had been refined since 1916, and its simplicity was its strength. The American Quonset, with its heavier I-beam ribs, larger and more cumbersome steel sheets, and more complex elliptical shape, required more men and more time. A similar-sized team would often need 6 to 8 hours, and sometimes longer, to complete a T2 model. In the context of a secure rear-area depot, this 2 to 4 hour difference was negligible. But on a contested beachhead, under the threat of air attack, or with an advancing front line demanding immediate supply dumps and medical stations, that difference was the difference between life and death. The Nissen could create functional shelter in half a daylight, a decisive advantage in mobile warfare. This disparity was exacerbated by the issue of foundations. The Nissen's lightweight and perfectly balanced arch required almost no site preparation. It could be erected on level ground, a simple concrete slab, or even a wooden platform. The Quonset, heavier and with a less stable stress distribution, often demanded more substantial anchoring, especially in soft ground or in areas prone to high winds. This added another step, more time, and more materials to the erection process. The Nissen could literally go anywhere almost instantly. The Quonset often required a more prepared site, limiting its immediate tactical utility. In terms of sheer durability and repairability, the Nissen's design philosophy again proved superior. Its segmented, truss-style ribs were more resilient to shock. A direct hit would destroy any structure, but the concussive force from a nearby blast would often be distributed more effectively through the Nissen's latticework, which could bend and deform without a complete, catastrophic failure. The Quonset's solid I-beams, while strong, were more brittle under sudden, immense stress. They were more likely to buckle or snap. Furthermore, the Nissen's use of simple, site-built timber end walls was a masterstroke of field logistics. If an end wall was damaged by shrapnel, a vehicle impact, or weather, it could be repaired or entirely rebuilt by a unit's carpenter using local wood and basic tools. The Quonset's prefabricated pressed steel end walls were monolithic. Once damaged, they were often beyond field repair, requiring a complex process of cutting and welding or, more likely, the replacement of the entire heavy component, which was usually impossible forward of the supply depot. A damaged Nissen was a temporary inconvenience. A similarly damaged Quonset was often a permanent loss. Theaters of operation further highlighted their differences. In the Pacific, where the U.S. Navy's Seabees were legendary for their speed, the Quonset became an icon. Yet, many Seabee memoirs note a preference for the smaller, faster-to-erect James Way hut or speak of the challenges of manhandling the heavy Quonset panels in tropical heat. In the European and North African theaters, British and Commonwealth forces could deploy entire field hospitals and workshops with a speed that consistently surprised their American allies, a capability owed in no small part to the rapid deployment of Nissen hut infrastructure. The head-to-head comparison reveals the fundamental truth about design philosophy. The Quonset hut was optimized for mass production and shipping efficiency from the American homeland. It was designed to be a complete, standardized product. The Nissen hut, by contrast, was optimized for final deployment and utility in a combat zone. It was designed not as a finished product, but as a kit of parts that empowered its users to solve problems quickly and resiliently. One was a testament to the power of the factory. The other, a testament to the brutal wisdom of the front line. In the global, industrial-scale conflict of World War II, both were needed, but when the shells were falling and the hours of daylight were few, the older, simpler, and faster British design consistently proved its mettle. When the last guns fell silent in 1945, the world was left not only with the scars of battle, but with a massive surplus of the material that had fueled the conflict. Among the countless items declared war surplus were hundreds of thousands of Nissen and Quonset huts. These structures, designed for the urgent temporariness of war, were now tasked with serving a world desperate for peace and struggling to rebuild. Their journey from military surplus to cultural icon would cement their legacy far beyond the battlefield, transforming them into symbols of austerity, innovation, and the relentless human capacity for adaptation. Yet, in this peacetime transition, the fundamental differences in their design would also shape the nature of their respective legacies. The immediate post-war period was one of global scarcity. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins, their housing stock obliterated. In this landscape of devastation, the humble corrugated steel hut became a vital lifeline. In Britain, surplus Nissen huts were pressed into service as emergency housing for families displaced by the Blitz, as temporary classrooms for children whose schools were gone, and as shops and community centers in towns struggling to return to normalcy. They were cold, damp, and stark, a constant reminder of the war's deprivation, but they provided a roof. Similarly, across the United States and its territories, Quonset huts found new lives on college campuses overwhelmed by returning GIs, as cheap housing in booming industrial towns, and as the first stores on the edges of new suburban developments. It was in this civilian adoption that the design philosophies of the two huts continued to assert themselves. The Nissen hut, with its simpler, more rugged design, was often seen as a temporary stopgap. Its use was pragmatic and unglamorous. Once the urgency of the housing crisis passed, most were dismantled and scrapped, their memory fading into a national recollection of a difficult, lean era. The Quonset, however, experienced a different fate. Its larger size, more room-like proportions, and the sheer volume of its surplus, coupled with aggressive marketing from American suppliers, made it a symbol of American can-do ingenuity and a catalyst for a unique architectural movement. The Quonset hut's semi-elliptical form, born from a desire for more interior space, proved remarkably adaptable to peacetime uses. Its clear-span interior was perfect for everything from churches to bowling alleys, from airplane hangars to art galleries. Architects like Pierre Koenig and others, fascinated by its industrial aesthetic and structural logic, began to experiment with it, seeing in its curved form a ready-made element of modernist design. It was affordable, available, and structurally honest. This led to a Quonset boom in the United States, where it became not just a temporary shelter, but a permanent and even fashionable building solution. It embodied a certain post-war American spirit, practical, optimistic, and unburdened by old-world traditions. The Nissen hut never achieved this level of architectural celebration. Its legacy remained more firmly rooted in its military efficacy. While the Quonset became a cultural icon of mid-century America, the Nissen is remembered in Britain as a symbol of the we-can-take-it spirit of two world wars. It is the hut of the Blitz, of the frontline workshop, of grim determination. This divergence in memory is a direct reflection of their inherent designs. The Quonset's peacetime success was a happy byproduct of its attempt to be more than a mere hut. The Nissen's enduring honor is a testament to its perfect fulfillment of its original, singular purpose. Their influence did not end with the 1950s. The engineering principles of the arched, prefabricated structure pioneered by Peter Nissen became embedded in global construction. The concept of the lightweight, self-supporting arch can be seen in everything from modern aircraft hangars and warehouse storage facilities to temporary disaster relief shelters. The entire philosophy of prefabricated kit-of-parts buildings that can be deployed rapidly to crisis zones anywhere in the world is a direct descendant of a logic that drove the production of both the Nissen and the Quonset. Today, the few remaining examples of these huts are treated with a reverence reserved for veterans. A preserved Nissen hut on a former airfield in Yorkshire stands as a museum piece, a solemn tribute to the airmen who slept within its curved walls. A Quonset hut in California, repurposed as a funky boutique or a rustic home, is a nostalgic icon of a bygone era of American optimism. They are the last survivors of a vast army of steel, reminders of a time when the fate of the world hinged not only on grand strategies and epic battles, but on the ability to quickly provide a dry place to sleep, a sterile space for surgery, or a secure shed to store the ammunition that would decide a battle. The Nissen and Quonset huts were not just buildings. They were fundamental units of industrial-age warfare and recovery. Their legacy is etched not in stone, but in corrugated steel, a lasting testament to the idea that the most enduring solutions are often those born from the most urgent necessities, and that speed, in war and in peace, is itself a form of strength.